G'day everyone. I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our 2022 webinar series and to today's wrap of the 2022 budget. I want to begin by acknowledging that Canberra is Ngunnawal country and pay my respects to elders past and present. Sovereignty was never ceded, and this always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Days and times for our webinars do vary, so please head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au so you don't miss out on our upcoming webinars. Next week is our fortnightly poll position with Catherine Murphy and Peter Lewis, so make sure you check that one out. But of course, you should all head to the Australia Institute's website and sign up, subscribe to hear from us. Later today, we'll be putting out our big budget analysis. Our comprehensive budget analysis will be going out later today, so make sure you signed up to hear that one. Just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can ask questions of our panelists, upvote other people's questions and make comments on them. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder, this discussion is being recorded and it will go up on australiainstitute.tv later today. So it is budget week and our economists and researchers have been poring over the budget papers to find out who wins, who loses, and what it means for Australia's economy and well-being in the future. It's important to note that this budget is early this year. It's normally in May. This time it's in March because obviously in May we'll be having a federal election, which does change the complexion of the budget just a little. For a bit of context, the Prime Minister is in a bit of a rough spot at the moment. The coalition is down in the polls. Summer was a bit of a disaster thanks to the Omicron wave of the pandemic. And now we have a series of climate-induced natural disasters, including flooding across northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland. Unemployment is low, but so is wages growth. Export prices are up, and so is the cost of living. That's just a little bit of context for the budget. And I'm delighted to introduce Richard Dennis, our chief economist, Matt Grudnoff, our senior economist, and Eliza Littleton, research economist at the Australia Institute, to talk about the budget. Thanks, Richard, Matt, and Eliza for joining us. Richard, I'll start with you. You were in the budget lockup. Can you just tell us a little bit about how you would describe this year's federal budget?
I'd describe it as a pre-election budget. I mean, you know, everything that we've heard for the last term of office, everything that we've heard for the last 10 years, jettison that. You know, let's not forget that this government was elected to solve a debt and deficit emergency, a budget emergency. So forget all of that. Promises made 3 years ago that the budget was back in surplus. Forget all of that. This is, as has been widely reported, a cash splash in the lead up to the election, which is obviously targeted at the groups they think are most likely to be swinging voters in the marginal seats that they're most likely to win. So we're having, so to put it into context, you know, we saw the government's plans on Tuesday night for how they plan to spend $150 billion. Sorry, $6 billion. Right, that's how much the government spends each year, $630 billion. And the primary purpose of that, according to the budget speech, was to swing a handful of votes in a handful of seats. Now, whether or not that works or not, time will tell, but it's no accident that we didn't increase unemployment benefits, but gave a one-off payment instead. It's no accident that there's no plan to boost wages growth, but wages are forecast to grow. And it's no accident that there's nothing in there to help address climate change, because the political strategy required by Scott Morrison is to get a handful of voters in a handful of seats to change their mind and swing to him. So people earning over $200,000 a year will get a $9,000 tax cut in 2024. The Treasurer didn't mention that because he knows they already know, right? So the whole budget speech left out the thing that they're proudest of, enormous tax cuts for high income earners. The fuel excise, who will benefit most from the fuel excise? The tradies driving the subsidized enormous utes, right? So, and then of course, wage subsidies rather than direct job creation who's going to benefit from a $15,000 wage subsidy? The builder employing the tradie, the apprentice tradie. So for a builder earning over $200,000, big tax cut coming their way, cheap petrol for their enormous vehicle coming their way, wage subsidy for the young people they're going to employ. What about the rest of us? Well, they think we won't switch our votes no matter what they give us, so they gave us nothing.
Matt, you're a veteran of many budgets as well. I might just come to you quickly for your kind of overall impression of the budget.
Yeah, this budget was special. It's different from all of the other budgets. I've had pre-election budgets before, but nothing this kind of gross and obvious. In particular, if you go back a couple of years, you might have remembered when Morrison was treasurer, he kept saying, oh, this isn't a budget, it's an economic plan. It's an economic plan. I don't know whether people
remember that one.
Yeah. I've never seen a budget so lacking in any kind of plan. So much so that after the election, the Labor Party have said, well, we'll have another budget this year, which, you know, as a budget fanatic, I love the idea of 2 budgets in 1 year. It's like 2 Christmases in 1 year. But I reckon if the coalition wins this election, they should have a budget after the election too, because there's nothing in this budget that goes beyond this election. This budget is totally and completely about the next 8 weeks. And, you know, you would be flattering it to say that it has a plan for the next 6 months, let alone for the next 4 years or the next 10 years.
Yeah. Eliza, I might come to you next, and I might just get you to move forward a little bit, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
Last year's budget had a lot of measures that seem to be targeted at women, in part, I think, to address some perceptions that the coalition government had been ignoring women or had a women's problem. How does this year's budget compare for women overall?
Yeah, great. So I think this year we still have a women's budget statement, which is really good. And the government announced that they would spend $2.1 billion on policies that they perceive as like women's policies. So they say that they're going to improve safety, health, and economic security for women with this money. And it's less than they spent last year. So I'd say they think they've apologized for everything they need to apologize for. And now we're just, you know, amongst other voters they're trying to attract. So, you know, not huge spending, but not no spending. The bulk of this spending is going towards like the implementation and transition towards a new national plan to address domestic violence for women. So more kind of short-term accommodation spending, more payments for survivors, better access to services and things like that. But I think the biggest issue with this kind of women's budget statement this year is that the government is treating issues that affect women as though they're isolated incidents rather than connected and part of a bigger kind of structural gender inequality that exists in our economy and society.
Richard, I know you had highlighted some specific domestic violence funding, I think, for a trauma recovery centre. Is that right? Can you just tell us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, no, thanks for asking. There's a wonderful organisation been pushing for the kind of policies that Eliza just referred to down in the Illawarra. And as a result of this budget, for the first time ever, there'll be funding for what I think is simple to describe as a one-stop shop for women who have been victims of domestic violence or sexual violence. And, you know, this is a wonderful thing, they're finally doing it. But let's be clear, right up until today, a woman who needed diverse treatments, everything from medical care to dental care to psychological care to the social work to try and organise for new crisis accommodation, historically and today for nearly every woman in this situation, they have to truck around to all those different places seeking all that different care, often concealing their movements from a violent partner, either with kids in tow or trying to organise childcare. So yeah, there are good initiatives in this budget, and I think the Illawarra Centre is a wonderful one. But boy, you know, here we are, one of the richest countries in the world, and we've only kind of just got to this point. So yeah, it's important to see that we can do this stuff. The question is, well, what are we going to do between now and the election to roll these sort of centres out far more broadly? And over the next 10 years, what are we going to do, not just to provide better support, but obviously to stop the violence happening in the first place?
Yeah, Eliza, I just want to come back to you on a specific issue, which was the changes to paid parental leave this year. On Radio National this morning, I heard the Minister for Women's Economic Security talking about this measure as really empowering families with choice about who is going to stay home to care for newborn children. But there's also been some criticisms of some of the impacts of this policy. Can you just walk us through the changes in the budget and why some people are concerned that these changes will exacerbate gender inequality?
Yeah, absolutely. So the main kind of two changes that have been made to the paid parental leave scheme that we have is that they've expanded eligibility for the paid parental leave scheme, and also they've merged the existing 18 weeks that kind of the primary caregiver of a newborn gets, which is usually a mother. A mother takes that, and they've merged it with the 2 weeks that is kind of reserved for dads or for secondary caregivers. And the issue with this, and it's true that it's giving potentially more choice or the illusion of choice to families, but it does mean as a result, or in context to all of the other kind of structural pressures on households and financial pressures on households, particularly when they have a newborn, they're going to choose to potentially, well, in a lot of cases, they're going to choose to have the partner with the lower income, which is usually women, take all the leave, which is just entrenching further women in these kind of primary carer positions. And it means they're going to be trapped in low wage sectors, in insecure work, more in the economy. So yeah, I think that this overall is a really bad move on the part of the government, and it's actually causing more issues for households and entrenching more gender roles within households.
And certainly we've seen the Australia Institute's Nordic Policy Centre make some of those criticisms. You can find those critiques on the website and on Twitter, but essentially a lot of the Nordic nations have found, correct me if I'm wrong, Eliza, that when dads and secondary caregivers are given kind of use it or lose it provisions, they do tend to take that leave, and it's better for families in a whole range of ways. Is that right?
Absolutely. So in countries where the paid parental leave is not transferable, so it's, it's dedicated to both parents in a specific amount, we see that like the take up by dads is much, much higher than in cases where paid parental leave is flexible and can be transferred between parents.
So the idea of choice there, sorry.
Well, yeah, exactly. Just to chime in on sort of the fallacy of choice to some extent, when we ignore these structural circumstances. Of course, choice is a nice word, and it's nice to have choice when all of the choices are attractive. But, if someone says, do you want a punch in the mouth or a kick in the guts, it's not really much of a choice. So just because you call it choice doesn't make it good. And to give you a clear example of this, in Australia, our retirement income system heavily relies now around superannuation, and the system is terribly skewed against women. But the word choice is used to conceal this. So if you choose to take a low-paid job in the caring professions, like, childcare or aged care, then you're choosing to put less into super each week. And if you choose to take time out of the labour market to care for a kid, then obviously you're choosing not to contribute any money to your super for those years. And if you choose to take time out of the labour market later in life, perhaps to care for a parent or your partner's parent, well, then again, you've chosen not to contribute much to super. So then when you retire, your choices mean that you have far less put away in super than a bloke who worked full time. And thanks to our tax system, the Commonwealth will have contributed far less to the superannuation of a woman who made all those choices than they do to a high income bloke who worked full time. So it's really easy to say women's choices cause their low superannuation balances, but I actually think it's obscene to frame it up as choice. So yeah, of course, choice is good, sometimes.
I can see we've got more than 600 people online with us today. Thanks so much for joining us for the Australia Institute's budget wrap. Matt, I want to come to you next on housing affordability, a perennial problem in Australia. There's nearly always some type of first home buyers grant in budgets, it seems to me, but housing also seems more unaffordable than ever. We did see, I think it was the Prime Minister just recommend that if people are having trouble struggling to make rental payments, could they just look into buying a house instead?
I think we should extend that logic. If you're struggling to buy groceries, you should buy a supermarket. Having trouble affording petrol, buy an oil refinery. Like, they're really simple solutions. Why didn't I think of that? It was staring us in the face.
I can't believe it. But Matt, what is in this budget that will help housing affordability, if there is anything?
Well, I mean, what have they got in the budget that they claim will help housing affordability might be very different to what will actually help housing affordability. And what they've got in the budget is basically they have this scheme where people can borrow smaller deposits. First home buyers can have a smaller deposit and in order to get a loan, in order to buy a house. Now, that might help some first home buyers into a house, but what it'll ultimately do is it will increase house prices. So it'll make housing actually less affordable. There are only two ways you could make housing more affordable. You can either decrease demand for housing, or you can increase supply for housing. And if you give everybody at the auction a little bit more money, what do you think is going to happen? Well, the price is going to go up. So if there are a bunch of first home buyers who can now borrow more because they need less of a deposit, well, then they'll all rock up to the auction and the person owning the house will get more for the house. But it won't make housing more affordable. If you wanted to make housing more affordable, you could decrease investor demand for housing by reforming the capital gains tax discount and negative gearing. Or the government could pump lots of money into social housing and build a whole lot more houses that would increase supply, and that would make housing more affordable. But this government and all governments so far seem to be much more interested in handing out more money to particular groups, which has the exact opposite effect of making housing more affordable.
And there's a giant con that sits at the heart of all of this debate about housing affordability. We don't talk about phone affordability. We don't talk about shirt affordability. We don't even talk about petrol affordability. We talk about the price. But no one wants to talk about the price of houses. Because if we ask the question, do you think house prices should go up or down? You're going to piss off a lot of people. Because 2/3 of Australians either own or are paying off a house, and in their head, they don't want the price of their house to fall. And the 1/3 that can't afford that house want the price to fall. So if we said, well, we want to push down the price of houses to help people who currently don't own them, that would be an honest thing to say, but it would also enrage 2/3 of the population. So we have this phony debate about housing affordability, where you're not allowed to mention the price of the house. And of course, the way we reconcile that is we say, oh, well, maybe if your incomes rose really fast, then you'd be able to afford a bigger house. Except we've got record low wage growth and there's no policies in place to increase wage growth. So let's be clear, no one's actually planning on helping. But it's just they don't want to come out and say, we don't want to push house prices down and we don't want to push your wages up. But I'd like to pretend I'm on your side. So let's all agree housing should be more affordable.
Even better. If the government accidentally stumbled onto a policy that made housing more affordable, I guarantee that they would rush in policies to stop those houses from falling in price. There is no government that wants housing to be more affordable. There's no government that wants to see housing prices, unfortunately at the moment, go down.
That does bring me actually to wages growth. Now that you've mentioned it, Richard, this budget was billed as a budget that had to address cost of living pressures. We've kind of talked about the price of petrol going up, but the big debate has really been about the fact that prices are rising, but that wouldn't be a problem if wages were also rising ahead of inflation, but that's not really happening. So what's happening with wages, Richard? And is there anything in this budget to help fix low wages growth?
Yeah, no, there's nothing in the budget to fix low wages growth except yet another forecast that they're about to pick up. Yeah, we talk a lot about cost of living pressures, but we don't talk much about benefit of working measures. Like the easiest way to improve people's capacity to cope with the cost of living, i.e. buying stuff, would be to boost the income they had to buy the stuff. But we've spent 20 years in Australia trying to push wage growth down.
And we've succeeded.
Mission accomplished.
Well
Give
done.
ourselves a tick. Lowest wage growth on record. Low productivity growth, low wage growth, no industrial disputation. Everything we've sort of, conservatives have set out to achieve, they've got there. And now, the dog that caught the car, they've just wound up with a mouthful of muffler. It's like, if only wages were growing, then the consumers would spend more money in the shops. Yeah, exactly. And they'd be paying more tax and everything else. So yeah, we've flipped it to cost of living. We're talking a lot, understandably, about the price of petrol and the price of some stuff that got more expensive during COVID. But the government can't do anything to push down the world price of oil. The government can't do anything to improve the supply of silicon chips going into manufactured stuff in Korea and China, but it can do something about wages here in Australia. And surprisingly, it's chosen not to.
Eliza, I know you work a lot in this space as well. We've heard a lot about this idea that, when unemployment hits a certain low level, that wages will grow. Is that what's happening?
Well, I mean, they're predicting that it will grow, right? And we saw some really optimistic forecasts in the budget, and we always see optimistic forecasts around wage growth. But I think one of the really, the problems with this debate is even if wages growth we saw record wage growth at, say, 3% unemployment. Well, this is like an artificial situation that we've created here, and it's not going to happen again. So if wage growth or normal wage growth requires a 3% unemployment rate, then we've got a broken system, because that's not going to happen again. And real wages will continue to be stagnant, and purchasing power of workers will continue to decline.
Yeah, and the unemployment rate that will suddenly spark wages growth keeps moving. I remember when it was in the low fives, and then it was a number with a 4 in front of it, and then it was low 4s, and now unemployment's 4%. It's something with a 3 in front of it.
Any day now, Matt.
Any day.
She's going to turn.
The unemployment rate required for wages to start growing is whatever the unemployment rate is minus what we currently have. So it's just a little bit lower than what we have, and then it's going to go nuts.
Yeah, it's the car trip that never ends. Are we there yet? Over the next hill.
And
Are we there yet? Over the next hill.
Exactly. And even if we did see wage growth, say, in a quarter, that's like 1/4 of wage growth. It's not going to make up for all the wage growth we've lost as a result of not having the right policies to encourage wage growth for the last how many
10
years.
And in case anyone thinks this is some sort of accident or oversight, what low wage growth means is high profit growth, right? So it's not like everyone's losing out of this accidental low wage growth. So the wage share of GDP has been doing this, and the profit share of GDP is doing this. So if you want to think of, the pie chart, the cake analogy, the slice of national income going to profits, it's been rising steadily. Whoops. Oh no.
What a mistake.
How did that happen?
How do we correct that?
Let's do nothing to turn that around as quick as we can. And the wage share's been falling. So yeah, it's no accident. We've changed the industrial relations system. We've changed the way the public sector pays its workers. We've changed all sorts of laws around the gig economy to reduce the bargaining power of workers. We treat students coming here to study as cheap labor, and then we're surprised that the impact it has on average wages. It's no accident that we've done this, and the consequence of low wage growth is high profit growth, but in Australia, it's impolite to mention that.
Yeah, I can see we've got nearly 700 people on the line with us. Just a reminder that you can ask questions of our panel by typing them into the Q&A box. I can see we've already got a dozen questions in there. Thank you so much for joining us today. And just a reminder, if you haven't already signed up to hear from the Australia Institute on our website at australiainstitute.org.au, our full budget analysis from our team of researchers and economists will be going out later today. So make sure you sign up on our website for that one. I'll come to questions from the audience very soon, but I did just want to touch on a couple of other things, and we might come back to them in the questions as well. But there's been a lot of talk about the cut to the fuel tax excise. Partly that's been in response to these cost of living pressures. But how much is that going to help in the long term? I'm not sure who to address this one to. Who wants to tackle the fuel?
Yeah, look, so they're spending $3 billion by basically cutting the fuel excise in half by about 22 cents a litre for 6 months. And they're doing that obviously because petrol prices have risen. Now, I would note that we keep hearing that the Ukrainian-Russian war is to blame, but petrol prices were almost $2 a litre before Russia invaded Ukraine. So that they're already high coming out of the opening up after the pandemic. And is it good policy? Well, it's pretty crap policy, actually. It's very bad policy. Why? Because it does nothing to make us less reliant on foreign oil. In fact, Australia is more reliant on foreign oil today than when the government came to power 9 years ago. And instead of spending $3 billion on fuel excise relief, imagine they'd spent that $3 billion over the last 9 years encouraging electric cars. Right now, we would have a large electric car market in Australia. We would also have a big secondhand car market. You'd have 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old secondhand electric vehicles that people could buy. So it's not just expensive, like often the criticism of electric vehicle policy is, oh, it just goes to rich people, but you would then have a secondhand market that people could get into. And how easy is it to get relief from petrol prices if you can go out and buy an electric vehicle and never have to buy petrol again?
Yeah.
And also, I mean, let's for once and for all kill off the idea that that sort of fuel excise funds our roads, because in the same budget where this government just slashed fuel excise by half, it promised to spend more money on roads. So it's always been crap, but at least could we just kill that off once and for all? Agree with everything Matt said, but it's also important to keep in mind that all we hear on budget night is some of the new things. You don't hear much about the old things. One of the old things is in Australia, we have billions of dollars a year in subsidies for people that drive those enormous four-wheel drive utes around our city. So the top selling cars in Australia, literally the top selling most common family vehicles are those enormous twin cab, Hilux, Ford Ranger, Isuzu D-Max, all the things that, you know, tower over most people at the traffic lights. In Australia, we spend billions of dollars a year subsidising businesses to buy them. And in the UK, the top selling car, not the top selling electric car, the top selling car is the Tesla Model 3. So we've spent years making our car fleet bigger and less fuel efficient. Australia is one of the only countries in the world to not have fuel efficiency standards for its cars. And here we are going, oh no, petrol's dear. What can we do about it? Well, we've made our society and our economy far more vulnerable to high petrol prices after years of deliberately dumb decision making.
That does seem to be a running theme on climate policy at the very least. I'm going to go to questions from the audience now, and I'm just going to stick with the fuel tax excise at the moment. Kathleen Davies has asked about the consequences of halving fuel excise to 22.1 cents a litre, and the concern about, polluting fossil fuel cars now being taxed less than clean electric vehicles. I wonder if, Richard, I could come back to you on that one in terms of, the climate implications of this decision.
Look, in the short term, the climate implications aren't going to be huge, but they are going to go in the wrong direction to the extent that high prices change our behavior, make us question our trips, make us question our choice of next car. We're dampening that signal. Now, most people aren't going to buy or sell their car in the next 6 months, but a lot of people are starting to think, wow, this whole petrol thing, now's a good time to get out. We're actually quite deliberately trying to slow their enthusiasm from change away. So yes, yet again, the so-called free marketeers, the so-called economic rationalists, rather than letting the market do what the market's doing, which is drive behavior, whenever they don't like the market outcome, they rush in with our money to compensate. So fossil fuel subsidies, Conservatives never have a problem with those. Electric vehicle or renewable energy subsidies, the sky is falling. So for all those people that carried on about how more people driving electric vehicles means there's no money for road taxes anymore, well, what nonsense. Yeah. We've just seen the same people who said electric vehicles were undermining our capacity to fund our roads turn around and go, you want $3 billion for your big dumb four-wheel drive? Sure, here you go. And let's be clear, the people who drive the biggest cars get the biggest benefit out of this excise reduction.
I've had a couple of questions sent in, Eliza. This one might be for you about higher education. We know that universities did it really tough during the pandemic. Is there any relief in sight in the budget papers this year?
Unfortunately, no. So actually, as you mentioned, it's one of the hardest hit sectors, and the university sector responded by cutting a lot of jobs. We actually did some research and we found out that around 35,000 jobs were lost from the sector in the 12 months leading up to May 2021. So huge implications for the sector. And the budget has added insult to injury for the sector, unfortunately. They've locked in a real funding cut of 3.4% over the forward estimates to higher education funding. And this is largely due to the legislated changes under the Job Ready Graduate Reform Package, which basically reduced the amount that the government is subsidizing per student to teach per student. And this has really perverse outcomes for the quality of teaching and research coming out of universities. And I'll just say one more thing about higher education funding. The new funding that exists in the budget for higher education is directed towards research, but it's directed towards incentivizing research that has commercial value. So connecting, it's kind of strengthening the bond between universities and the private sector. At face value, this is, not terrible, but we do it does have implications for the integrity of research, for academic freedom, and for making sure that other types of research that say doesn't have direct that we can't see the direct value of gets done. And this is unfortunately just the next policy in a long line of policies trying to force universities to produce research output that has commercial value.
Matt, the next question I've got is for you. It's from Susan Thomas, and she says, is there too much funding for future defence compared to basic services for people now? She's also got a question about fossil fuels, but I'm going to set that aside to ask for later. So can you just talk to me about defence spending in particular in this budget?
Yeah, so defence was apparently the big winner, particularly if you listen to the rhetoric of the government. They were talking about hundreds of billions of dollars more for hardware, for big toys for the military. They were talking about $10 billion more for cyber security. They were talking about a massive expansion in the number of people in the armed forces. But if you look in the actual budget papers, there's very, very little. despite hundreds of billions of dollars in announcements, over the next 4 years, it was less than $1 billion. I'll give you a great example. So the cyber security, they were talking about $10 billion over the next 10 years, which you might think, well, you know, that's $1 billion a year, except that over the next 4 years, the 4 years of that 10 years, we only get $500 million. That's 5% of the funding is over the next 4 years. The rest of it is off somewhere else. And one of the problems with the military spending in this budget, apart from the fact that that seems to be the only focus, is that it's like so many things that this government does. It's a big announcement without any substance behind it.
The next question that I've got is from Brendan Marnie, who talks about the framing of that taxes fund spending, fiscal framing as being damaging. Can you, Richard, talk to us about how this budget approaches spending and getting people thinking more in terms of spending to reward good behaviours and taxes to discourage bad behaviours? I know that's a topic you've talked about in your book, Big, the Role of the State in the Modern Economy, which I can see on the bookshelf behind you. Richard, can you just talk to us about that? Because that kind of tackles that idea of, you know, big spending is good, but, you know, you can't just spend it on anything.
Yeah, and thanks to whoever put the book on the bookshelf. Thank you very much. Yeah, well, look, it's interesting. I mean, let's start at the beginning. Not a peep out of Josh Frydenberg about living within our means anymore. Not a peep about burdening future generations if we don't deliver a balanced
debt and deficit disaster.
Debt and deficit disaster. Well, to be fair, that was Tony Abbott, you know, same government. So yeah, so big picture, like there's much to celebrate here. The bizarre, baseless, uneconomic assertion that if you don't collect as much tax every year as you spend, bad things will happen, that's gone. Like it's Josh Frydenberg said he delivered a balanced budget 3 years ago, and he didn't. And now in the next 10 years of forecasts, the Liberals won't. So step one, the idea that you need to collect taxes so you can afford to spend money, it's not true, was never true, and the coalition have now jettisoned it. Unconvinced? Well, keep in mind that the last time a US president delivered a surplus budget was a guy called Bill Clinton, and the last UK prime minister to deliver one was Tony Blair. All right, so the rest of the world knows this. Australia's kind of had this bizarre sort of belief that if we didn't have a budget surplus, bad things would happen. It's never been true. Taxes do play a very important role in our economy, however. Taxes, yes, designed well. They discourage us from doing things we want people to do less of. Excises on alcohol, excises on tobacco, excises on petrol, and for a while a tax on carbon. These are all good things. They directly change behaviour. And over the medium and long term, and taxes also play a very important short-term role in reducing income inequality. So they change our behaviour, they shift resources from people with a lot to people with the least. And over the medium and long term, if you want to have a big public sector, if you want to have big publicly funded health and education and aged care and childcare, then you need to collect a lot of tax. The biggest spending countries in the world are the biggest taxing economies in the world. That's no accident, because you need to create room for those activities to take place. So tax is really important. It does lots of things, but yeah, we are finally free of the bizarre idea that if we don't collect enough taxes to exactly match what we spend, where will the money come from? Same place it's come from forever, same place it comes in every country around the world. The government can borrow money whenever it wants on good terms.
Yeah. The next question I've got, Matt, is probably one for you. And it's one that a lot of people have upvoted. So I think it's kind of one of those economics things that maybe people just would like a hand peeking behind the curtain on. Why did we measure unemployment by working for 1 hour per week as the statistic that we base that all around? Can you just talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So if you work 1 hour a week, then you're counted as employed. Why is that the case? Well, when they were coming up with the international standard of how to measure unemployment, so it's good to have similar or exactly the same measure of unemployment. So we can look at the US unemployment rate, we can look at Australia's unemployment rate, we can look at the UK's unemployment rate, and we can compare them because they're measuring the same thing. Well, when they were doing this was back in the 40s and 50s. So if you worked 1 hour, chances are you were full-time, all right? There wasn't that many jobs back then that were very short hours. Even today, the ABS actually releases figures for people who are working, I think it's less than 5 hours in a week. So counted as employed, but only working a few hours. And it's only actually a very tiny percentage, a very, very small fraction of the total amount of employed. So it's not a lot of people that are in this category. There might be people who are working a few hours in a job, but they often have multiple jobs. And so therefore the total amount of hours they're working is quite a bit. So it's not a big effect. But the question is if 1 hour of employment doesn't count as employed, how many hours would it have to be? And that's the other question that once you start thinking about it, should it be 5 hours? Should it be 10 hours? Should it only be full-time employees? And once you kind of think about it like that, well, they've got to kind of draw the line somewhere. And it's just that the international standard drew it at 1 hour.
I'm going to be more defensive of our statisticians here. If you're working for an hour, if someone pays you for an hour's work, you are employed. You aren't very much employed. You certainly aren't full-time employed. You're very unlikely to be able to pay your rent or buy a house even. Maybe you can buy a house but not pay the rent. Who knows? But if you work for 1 hour a week, you are employed. And if you are employed, you can't be unemployed. So the statistical definition is fine. The problem is the perverse way politicians and other people have used these statistics over time. And that's to suggest, well, if the unemployment rate's low, everyone must be fine. No, that's not true at all. There are people working full-time who can't afford to buy a house or rent one. Going to have to start reversing the order of that. Yeah. So you see what I'm saying? So the problem isn't the way we define employment and unemployment. There are problems, but that's not the big problem. The problem is the way we're deliberately misled by people who should understand those statistics a lot better.
And by the way, the ABS totally puts out stats on underemployment.
They totally put out stats.
They totally put out stats. Sorry, I'm doing the youth thing.
Matt got very excited.
But also discourage workers who have given up looking for work. There is a whole raft of statistics that the Australian Bureau of Statistics puts out that the government knows about and could use, but they choose not to. They choose to use this unemployment stat that at the moment makes them look very good, even if it's a deceptive number. And that's really just that's not a problem with the measurement. That's a problem with just sort of focusing on one tiny thing and saying, well, that's representative of everything that's good in the economy.
Eliza, I want to come back to you on youth unemployment, because I know you've done a little bit of work in that sector. Can you just talk to us about what that picture looks like? Because often budgets focus not so much on young people, and we've seen some measures here for apprenticeships and other things, but can you just give us a picture of what youth unemployment looks like or has looked like over the past year?
Yeah, so the pandemic has wreaked havoc for young workers. And when I say young, I'm talking about workers between the ages 15 and 24. I mean, outside of this category, absolutely as well. So the research that we've done has suggested that they were the hardest hit, and they were disproportionately hit by job losses during the kind of multiple periods of the pandemic. And this is because they're concentrated in industries that were really impacted by the pandemic. So hospitality, retail, tourism, things like this. But they're also concentrated in casual jobs as well. And they're more likely to have held those casual jobs for less than 12 months. And the reason that's important is because one of the eligibility criteria for JobKeeper was that casual workers would only receive JobKeeper, or would be eligible to receive JobKeeper if they'd had their casual job for more than 12 months. So basically there was very little protection for young workers over the pandemic, and it's revealed a lot of the fault lines that already exist. And let me just say, before the pandemic, young people were doing it tough anyway. They're much more likely, as I said, to be represented in casual work and in industries with higher turnover. And this job insecurity has really not been addressed in this budget at all. So yeah, basically, there's not a lot in the budget for young people. And I would say, if we're talking about the long term, like the fact that there's not more spending on transitioning our electricity grid towards renewable energy is one of the biggest problems or one of the biggest ways that the government has not addressed the welfare of young people today and into the future.
Yeah, certainly. That's a big one we haven't touched on yet. I might come back to climate in just a second, and we'll get to that. But Richard, I wanted to ask you this question from Tyrone Delisle, who says, the media are talking up the issue of inflation. What is the risk of inflation from this budget? And would it be due simply to government spending, or how that spending is done within the real economy?
Yeah, no, good question. So inflation refers to sustained increases in prices. And we measure prices through something called the CPI, the Consumer Price Index. There's a hint in the name. It's an index of the prices we pay for consumer goods. So there's two main there's two main causes of inflation. There's supply side and there's demand side causes. Now, the supply side, we've seen all sorts of supply chains disrupted by COVID. And when things are rare, think prawns at Christmas time. And that's a bad example. I'll use that for demand. When there is a cyclone or a flood and it wipes out a crop, there's not much of the crop left. So people bid up the price of what's left. Okay, so there's big shortages across all sorts of global supply chains at the moment for everything from silicon chips to the timber we use in roofs in houses. So because of a shortage of physical ability to supply stuff, the price gets bid up. And that's been happening, and that's been causing inflation around the world and here in Australia. We don't have high inflation, it's just higher than it's been. And then there's demand inflation. If come Christmas time, we all rush out and think, oh, it's Christmas and we're celebrating the birth of Jesus, and what better way to do that than by buying prawns? If we all rush out and try and buy prawns at the same time, the price goes up, right? So that's the demand side driving up price. So a shortage of supply can push up price, a surge in demand can push up price. Now, what's happened is we've got a bit of inflation at the moment that's being driven by the supply side, shortages of stuff, and then the government's come along and said, hey, can I give you all some money? Here, have some money. I hear you're feeling a bit grieved at the moment, so go and spend some money. There's a very real risk that we're going to see some demand side, some demand pull inflation, as it's called, on top of these supply side disruptions. So if the business press was doing its job seriously, they'd probably be shouting a lot louder at this government saying, is this really a good time to be shoveling cash onto high income earners who can well and truly afford to pay for more petrol? Sure, you might want to give some support to low income earners who are struggling, but do you really think now is a good time to shovel money onto high income earners? But because so many people in Australia want to see the government re-elected and they want to see big tax cuts that will come, you know, the usual criticism that you'd get of the government over its pretty expansionary, arguably quite reckless spending policies is quite muted. So yeah, there is a real risk of inflation being driven by this budget, but everyone's pretending not to notice.
Yeah, and Matt, just coming back to you on that one, I mean, we have talked a lot about the fact that the Australia Institute has been calling for a lot more big spending budgets in the past when the focus was on debt and deficit. Richard's talked about the inflationary problems there, but in the past during the pandemic, you talked about the importance of spending that delivers lasting benefits to the community. Are we seeing that type of spending in this year's budget?
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is no. So if you think back to the GFC, when we had a big spending, some big spending budgets and some programs to try and stimulate the economy, we got things like school halls. So if you've got a kid in primary school or high school, you've probably sat in an auditorium that was built from that money. Now, the GFC is long gone, but those halls still remain. Unfortunately, out of this pandemic and out of this budget, what we get is just cash being handed out, or it's given in ways that basically has no long-term benefit. You can't point to something at the end. Whereas we could have had things where we built permanent things. We made permanent changes that benefit us long into the future. Those school halls, those school libraries will benefit for decades to come. Long after the stimulus is no longer needed, those benefits will be still there. Unfortunately, the way we've done the stimulus this time has been very transitory.
I want to come now to, we've got a couple of questions in here about climate change. Richard, Michael O'Halloran says, what is there in the budget that will help us achieve net zero emissions by 2050?
Oh, net zero.
It's a bit like the
net zero budget measures.
We just say it will happen and it will happen.
Yeah, no, there's net zero for the climate in there. And again, that's no accident. And just can bring together the climate stuff and what Eliza was talking about before about youth. I wrote a piece for Junkie on exactly this, how Scott Morrison's really betting that young people are less likely to vote, they're less likely to enroll to vote, they're less likely to kind of pay close attention to budgets. So he's kind of betting he can ignore them. Now I hope everyone watching wants to prove him wrong, but he's betting that of all the groups to kind of go after, young people ain't it, because they're disengaged and literally aren't enrolled to vote in larger numbers. So yeah, again, it's no accident that there's not much in there on climate change. There's tiny little stuff about building some microgrids to help renewables in regional Australia. That's fine. It had already been announced. It's ARENA funding. So yeah, it's the words got mentioned because they didn't want to give their opponents the easy shot of, you didn't even say climate change. They did say it, but they haven't done anything. And again, let's not focus too much on the budget speech and think about what's in the budget. Australian Institute research suggests there's $11 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. $11 billion a year in fossil fuel subsidies. Usually you subsidize things you want more of. We are still exploring for gas fields and oil fields and coal deposits, not building new mines or wells, exploring. Why? In what world do we ever think that that'll get sold? And the answer is a world that hasn't tackled climate change and hasn't transitioned. We're building $1 billion publicly funded gas-fired power station in Kurri Kurri in New South Wales. So the idea that we're kind of doing everything we can, what we're doing is actually subsidizing the oil and gas industry, expanding fossil fuel exploration, the other word that starts, extraction and sales. And then, we're using dodgy carbon credits, to pretend that it's all good and we're going to get to net zero, by pretending that, we didn't chop down enough trees or something or other. So, yeah, so the budget talks a bit about net zero, but it's actually subsidizing an expansion of fossil fuels, and it's hiding that expansion under promises that enormous amounts of carbon credits will be generated, even though, as we've seen in recent weeks, there's enormous integrity concerns with these dodgy credits.
Absolutely, and people should check out the 7:30 report story on that. And the Australian Institute separately has some research from earlier this year and some more recent research concerning those integrity questions around carbon credits. Eliza, is there anything that you wanted to add? I know you helped write the report on fossil fuel subsidies. It is based on budget papers, but not necessarily this federal budget. But a lot of that increase in fossil fuel subsidies was driven by the federal government. Is that right?
Absolutely. So a lot of states and territories actually spent less money subsidizing the fossil fuel industry in the last budget than they did the budget before. But the federal government made up for all the difference, and I think was it quadrupled their spending on fossil fuels between those 2 years of budget. So really a poor outcome for everyone. And this is not going to disappear anytime soon, because they baked in $55 billion of subsidies over the forward estimates as well. So yeah, this is not the last time you will see those fossil fuel subsidies in the budget. Yeah, plenty more to come.
Sticking with you, Eliza, Sarah Baker has a question here asking, wouldn't legislating paid superannuation on maternity leave have been a better policy to close the structural economic gender pay gap? Could you speak to us a little bit about that one?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely would have been a much better policy, particularly because the policy they did introduce was so poor. But yes, absolutely. Women definitely go backwards in terms of the superannuation that they're accumulating when they take time out of the workforce to look after children. So yeah, making sure that women don't go backwards in terms of their superannuation during those periods of time that they may spend outside of the labour force would do a lot to improve the superannuation balance for women when they retire later in life. And at the moment, yeah, there's a huge gap between superannuation balances between men and women when they actually need to start using that money.
I agree. Sorry, I agree exactly what Eliza said, and it's not nearly enough.
Yeah.
Right? If women earn less than men when they're working full time, then they're contributing less to super every week, and they're getting smaller tax concessions and support from the government every week. And sure, at the moment, when they take time off work, they go further backwards. Right. And that's terrible. And of course, we should stop them going further backwards. But stopping them going further backwards doesn't actually ever get them up anywhere near the contributions that people who are earning higher incomes, working full time and getting much greater government contributions can. So yeah, absolutely. We need to stop women going further backwards when they go off on paid parental leave. You bet we should. But stopping them going further backwards is not actually driving them up towards anything like parity.
Yeah. This speaks to the point I was making earlier about treating these issues or these women's policies issues as separate things that are not connected when they absolutely are. And yeah, we need to address the issue in superannuation and the gender gap. We need to make sure that women are not concentrated in low wage industries, in insecure jobs. Yeah, and make sure that the quality of employment is lifted for everyone.
Yeah. I've got a couple of questions in here about the floods in northeast New South Wales and southeast Queensland. And unfortunately, we don't have time to get into it, but I would just like to direct everyone to the Australia Institute's website and the research that we've done on creating a national climate disaster fund, including a levy on fossil fuel exports to help basically fund disaster recovery and mitigation and things like that. There's some really fantastic research on that there, and our thoughts go out to the people of Lismore, Byron, and the rest of northern New South Wales and southeast Queensland affected by the floods. Just some truly awful scenes after, not that long since the last flood crisis, only a matter of days, if not a week or so. So just awful scenes there, and we do send our thoughts to everyone there. We are going to have to wrap it up there. Thank you so much, everyone, for your fantastic questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to them all. If we didn't get to your question, please make sure you're subscribed on our website to get the Australia Institute's full Budget 2022 analysis later today. That's australiainstitute.org.au. Don't forget to sign up and subscribe to our Follow the Money podcast. You can find that wherever you normally listen to podcasts, and our most recent couple of podcast episodes cover that brilliant fossil fuel subsidies report that Eliza helped co-author, as well as a bunch of other amazing issues, and including some of our recent webinar guests as well. So please check that out if you can. Thank you so much for joining us today. Thank you to Richard, Eliza, and Matt for your time, and hopefully stay safe out there, everyone. And we'll see you next week for our fortnightly poll position with Guardian's Catherine Murphy and Essential Media's Pete Lewis. Thanks very much, everyone. Stay safe out there, and we'll see you next week.
Thanks, Eb.